Picture the coldest kind of silence, not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a man staring at everything he has left in the world, a dying tractor, $23 in his pocket, and a dealer who just laughed in his face. That's where Danny Jarvis was standing on a March morning in 1968, 22 years old, father dead 3 years, brother long gone, 160 acres of Oklahoma red dirt that needed plowing. In 3 weeks. And the only machine that could do it was sitting in a dealership parking lot, grinding and clanking like it was trying to shake itself apart from the inside. Carl Becker walked out to meet him. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Carl was 53 years old, 25 years in the business, the kind of man whose confidence came from decades of being the smartest person in every room he walked into. He cocked his head, listened to the sound the engine was making, and shook his head the way a doctor shakes his head when the test results aren't good. That doesn't sound good, son. No, sir, it doesn't. Crankshaft, Carl said. Cracked or broken. That tractor isn't going anywhere until it's fixed. Danny felt the bottom of his stomach fall out. The crankshaft was the heart of the entire machine. The part that took the piston's raw explosive power and converted it into spinning force. The thing that made every other part of the engine mean something. A cracked crankshaft didn't just mean expensive repairs. It meant the engine was dying, slowly, loudly, and irreversibly. How much to fix it? Carl wiped his hands on a rag. Did some mental math. New crankshaft machining. Labor. You're looking at $800, give or take. $800. Danny had $23 in his pocket and maybe 40 more in a coffee can back at the farmhouse. $800. Might as well have been 8 million. I don't have that kind of money, Mr. Becker. I know you don't, son. Nobody your age does. Carl's voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't even unkind. It was something almost worse. It was practical. Matter of fact. The voice of a man who had seen this exact situation 100 times and already knew how it ended. I can offer you another option. I'll buy the whole tractor. $200, scrap value. You can put it towards something newer, something that actually works. $200. For a machine his father had bought in 1952. For the tractor. Danny had learned to drive on before he learned to drive a car. For 16 years of Oklahoma seasons, every planting and every harvest, every early morning and every late night. $200. What if I fixed the crankshaft myself? Carl laughed. Not a mean laugh. Almost friendly, actually. The laugh of a man who's just heard something charming and impossible, like a child saying they want to fly to the moon by flapping their arms. Son, you can't fix a cracked crankshaft. That's precision machining. You need a machine shop, specialty, tools, years of professional training. That's not something you do in your barn with good intentions. What about welding? Could I weld the crack? The laugh got louder. Weld a crankshaft. Carl shook his head, still chuckling like he was going to be telling this story at dinner tonight. Look, I admire your spirit. I really do. But some things just cannot be fixed. A cracked crankshaft is one of them. The stress, the heat cycles, the precision tolerances, a weld would never hold. You'd be throwing your time and your money straight into the dirt. How much would the welding rod cost? Be? Carl sighed. $5, $10 for the materials, but you'd be wasting every penny. That weld won't last a month. Maybe not even a week. Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll take my chances. He climbed back onto the dying tractor and drove it home. 12 miles. The grinding sound got worse with every single one of them. Carl Becker stood in his parking lot and watched him go, shaking his head at the stubborn foolishness of youth. He turned to his mechanic and said words he would spend the next 18 years thinking about. That boy is going to learn an expensive lesson. Some things can't be fixed. Better to know that now than later. Here's what Carl Becker didn't know. He didn't know who he was actually talking to. To understand what Danny Jarvis did next, you have to understand where Danny Jarvis came from. Not just the farm, not just the dead father, not just the poverty. Those things are the setting. What Matters is what Danny had built inside himself long before that March morning. Danny was born in 1946, the second son of Harold and Mary Jarvis. The farm was 160 acres of Oklahoma red dirt, not the best land in the county, not the worst. Just honest ground that rewarded sweat and punished laziness. His father, Harold, died in 1965, a heart attack in the middle of spring planting, sudden as a door slamming. His older brother, Tom, had already left for the oil fields in Texas. His younger sister, Ellen, was 14 and still in school. That left Danny. 19 years old, no transition, no training, no time to grieve. One week, he was a farm kid helping out. The next week, he was a farmer trying to keep 160 acres from dying. He didn't get to fall apart. He just had to keep moving. But here's the thing about Danny Jarvis that nobody at that dealership knew. While other boys in high school were chasing Friday nights and football games, Danny Jarvis was spending his free periods in the shop class. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Mr. Patterson, the shop teacher, was a former Navy welder who had spent World War II working on battleships. He didn't teach welding as a trade skill. He taught it as a philosophy. Welding isn't just about melting metal, Mr. Patterson used to say. It's about understanding metal, how it behaves when it heats, how it contracts when it cools, how stress moves through a structure, how different alloys respond differently under different conditions. You master that, truly master it. And you can fix almost anything. You can fix things other people have given up on. Danny didn't just listen. He absorbed it. By his senior year, he was doing repair work that made Mr. Patterson stop and look twice. Complex joints at difficult angles, repairs that other students couldn't figure out. He had the hands for it. Patient, steady, impossibly precise. You could make a real career out of this, Mr. Patterson told him once. Good welders are always needed, always. I'm going to be a farmer, Danny said. Like my dad. Then you'll be a farmer who can weld, Mr. Patterson said. That's a powerful combination, don't ever forget that. Danny didn't know how right that was, not yet. He wouldn't know until that morning in March 1968, standing in a parking lot with a dying tractor and a man's laughter echoing in his ears. Monday afternoon. Danny drove the farmall into the barn and started tearing the engine apart. He had never fully disassembled an engine before. He worked slowly, carefully, setting every bolt and gasket and bracket in order, because he couldn't afford to lose anything, and he couldn't afford to be wrong. By Tuesday morning, the crankshaft was on his workbench. The crack was obvious once you knew where to look. A hairline fracture running across one of the main bearing journals, the smooth, precision-machined surface where the crankshaft spun inside its bearings. Exactly the kind of damage Carl had described. The kind of damage that turned a working engine into scrap. Danny studied that crack for a long time. He thought about everything Mr. Patterson had taught him. He thought about metal and stress and heat. He thought about what a crankshaft actually does, spinning thousands of times every minute, absorbing the explosive force of every piston firing, transferring all of that force to the transmission. The forces involved were enormous, constant, relentless. Carl was right about one thing: a regular weld would never hold. The stress would crack it again within days, maybe hours. A standard weld would be throwing money away. But what if it wasn't a standard weld? That afternoon, Danny drove to town and spent $12 at the hardware store on specialty welding rod, the kind rated specifically for high-stress applications, the kind most farmers had never even seen. He spent another $3 at the auto parts store on a grinding wheel and precision files, $15 total. Then he went back to the barn and got to work. What Danny did over the next 2 days was not luck. It was not desperation. It was precision engineering, executed with handmade tools in a barn in rural Oklahoma by a 22-year-old farmer who had paid very close attention in shop class. First, he ground out the crack, not trying to close it, but widening it into a deliberate V-shape that would give the weld proper depth and surface area to bond to. This step alone took hours. It had to be done exactly right. Then he preheated the entire crankshaft. slowly, carefully, bringing the temperature up uniformly across the whole piece, because he knew that if you weld cold metal, the weld zone heats and expands while the surrounding metal stays cool and contracted, and that differential creates new stress fractures before the old ones are even filled. Carl's mechanics would have laughed at this step. Most backyard welders had never heard of it. The welding itself took 4 hours. Slow, methodical passes, building up layer after layer of new metal, never rushing, never forcing, letting the work tell him what it needed. Mr. Patterson's voice was in his head the entire time. When he finished, he wrapped the crankshaft in insulating blankets and let it cool over 12 full hours. No shortcuts, no impatience. Controlled cooling to prevent any new thermal stress from undoing everything he had done. When he finished, he wrapped the crankshaft in insulating blankets and let it cool over 12 full hours. No shortcuts, no impatience. Controlled cooling to prevent any new thermal stress from undoing everything he had done. Thursday morning, he ground and polished the weld until it was smooth. Until you almost couldn't find it if you didn't know where to look. He measured the alignment, the balance, the roundness of the journals, using tools he had borrowed from Mr. Patterson's shop, and it came back as close to perfect as human hands could produce without a machine shop. Thursday night and Friday morning, he reassembled the engine. Every part back in its exact place. Every bolt torqued right. Friday afternoon, Danny Jarvis climbed into the seat of a tractor that a professional dealer had said was unfixable. He said a quiet prayer for farmers and fools, and he turned the key. The engine caught. It ran. It sounded good, clean and steady. None of the grinding death rattle that had been getting worse for 3 days. He let it idle for an hour, listening, waiting for the sound that would tell him, Carl. Becker had been right after all. Nothing. He drove it around the barnyard. Nothing. He drove it out to the fields and back. Nothing. The $15 weld was holding. News in small towns doesn't travel slow. By the following Monday, the entire county knew that Danny Jarvis had welded his own crankshaft and that the repair had held. Carl Becker heard it and didn't believe it. So he drove out to the Jarvis farm to see for himself. He found Danny in the field, plowing, the farm all running smooth and strong, the engine turning over clean and quiet under a March sky. Carl stood at the edge of the field and watched for a few minutes, just listened. When Danny reached the end of the row and shut the tractor down, Carl walked over. Mr. Becker. Danny. Carl looked at the tractor, then at Danny, then back at the tractor. I heard you fixed it. Yes, sir. Welded the crankshaft. Yes, sir. Carl was quiet for a moment. I've been in this business 25 years. I have never seen anyone weld a crankshaft and have it hold. There's a first time for everything. I suppose there is. Carl walked up to the tractor. You mind if I listen to it? Danny started the engine. Carl leaned in close, his ear near the engine block, listening the way he had listened to engines. For a quarter century. After a full minute, he straightened up. Sounds good. I wouldn't believe it if I wasn't hearing it myself. Thank you, sir. Carl looked at Danny with an expression that carried respect and irritation in equal measure. That weld won't last, you know. Might hold a month, might hold a year. Eventually, the stress will find it again. A crankshaft takes too much punishment, Danny. Just smiled. Then I'll weld it again. Carl laughed, a completely different laugh than the one in the parking lot. This one had something genuine in it, something that sounded a lot like admiration he hadn't planned to feel. You're a stubborn one, aren't you? My father always said that was my best quality. Carl turned to leave. Then he stopped. If you ever want a job, come see me. I could use someone who can fix what can't be fixed. I've got a farm to run, Mr. Becker, but I appreciate the offer. Carl drove away, shaking his head. He didn't know that in 18 years he would be working for the boy he just laughed at. He didn't know that the boy with $23 in his pocket was going to buy his building. He didn't know that the $15 weld was going to outlast his entire business. But we'll get to that. For 18 years, nobody called Danny Jarvis by his real name. not in the parts they actually meant. They called him Junkyard Danny. It started as an insult. The kind of thing people say about a man who won't admit something is beyond saving. The kind of label meant to communicate foolishness, dressed up as determination. Junkyard Danny, the guy who drags broken things home and thinks he can put them back together. By 1975, it had become the most valuable brand in 3 counties. Let me explain how that happened, because it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. After the crankshaft repair, the word spread the way word always spreads in rural communities, through the grapevine of men leaning against fence posts and women talking at church and neighbors who happened to share the same feed store on the same morning. Within 6 months, other farmers started showing up at the Jarvis farm, not to buy anything, not for social calls. They came with broken equipment and desperate expressions, the same look Danny had worn in Carl Becker's parking lot, a cracked transmission housing, a broken hydraulic cylinder, a snapped axle shaft, equipment that local dealers had quoted repair prices nobody could afford, equipment that replacement parts alone would cost more than the machines were worth, the kind of machinery that every rural county in America had sitting behind barns, rusting slowly, waiting for someone to either fix it or let it die. Danny didn't say yes to everything. Some things really were beyond what he could do. He was honest about that. He would look at a piece of equipment, turn it over, think about it carefully, and sometimes tell a man that what he needed wasn't welding, it was replacement. He didn't take jobs he wasn't confident about. That integrity was part of what built the reputation, but more often than anyone expected, including Danny, he found a way. He didn't charge much. Couldn't, really. These were his neighbors, people living the same precarious existence he was living. A few dollars for materials, a little extra for his time, enough to cover costs and not much more. He was not getting rich. He was building something else, something harder to measure and far more durable than money. He was building a reputation for doing the impossible, and through all of it, through 1969, 1970, 1972, 1975, the farm all ran. The $15 weld held. Carl Becker had said a month, maybe a year. Year after year, the weld disagreed. Now, while Danny was building his reputation, Carl Becker was building something too. Something that looked a lot better on paper in 1975 than it would in 1982. The 1970s were boom years for American agriculture. Commodity prices were high, land values were climbing, and the mood in farm country was something close to optimistic, which is not a feeling that comes naturally to farmers, so when it showed up, it brought recklessness with it. Carl Becker sold more tractors in the 1970s than he had in the previous 20 years combined. New John Deeres rolled off his lot week after week, financed on 5-year credit agreements that farmers signed without sitting down to do the math. Carl was good at his job. He was good at painting pictures of efficiency and productivity and the money you were leaving on the table by holding on to old equipment. That old tractor is costing you money every day you keep it, he would tell them. The new models are more powerful, more efficient, more everything. Trade it in, upgrade. Your operation deserves it. The farmers listened. They traded their paid-off machines for shiny new ones. They took on debt that felt manageable when corn was selling for $4 a bushel and land was going up every year. Carl wasn't dishonest. He believed what he was selling. He had seen booms before, and somewhere in the back of his mind he probably knew this one would eventually end. But the money was coming in, and the lot was moving, and the future felt solid. Booms always feel solid, right up until they don't. The farm crisis arrived in the early 1980s like a slow-moving catastrophe, the kind where you can see it coming for months, but there's nothing you can do to stop it. Interest rates spiked to levels that made farmers physically sick when they did the math. Commodity prices crashed, land values collapsed by 40, 50, 60% in some areas. Suddenly, every farmer who had borrowed money against land that was worth less than the loan was staring at a hole they couldn't climb out of, and Carl Becker's dealership was staring at the same hole from the other side. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of selling on credit. You don't get paid until your customer pays, and when the customer can't pay, you can't either. And your bank still wants its money on schedule regardless of what's happening to anyone's crops. By 1983, Carl was repossessing more tractors than he was selling. His lot filled up with equipment that nobody could afford to buy. His bank started asking questions he didn't have good answers for. The confident, successful dealer who had laughed at a young farmer's $15 repair was watching 30 years of work come apart. And out in the county, 3 counties by now, farmers were driving to a barn that had become a workshop, carrying their broken equipment to a man who charged what they could afford and fixed what nobody else would touch. Fix it, don't replace it. That was the motto of the 1980s farm crisis. And nobody fixed things like Junkyard Danny. By 1983, Danny's barn had a proper welding setup, a lathe, a milling machine, all of it used, all of it repaired and calibrated by his own hands. He was still farming his 160 acres, still putting crops in and pulling them out, but the repair work had grown into something that was almost as large as the farming itself. He had been saving money for 18 years, not large amounts, nothing dramatic, just consistently, carefully. The way a man saves money when he remembers exactly what it felt like to have $23 in his pocket and nowhere to turn. Every repair job that paid more than it cost. Every season, the farm came in above. What it spent, every dollar that didn't need to be spent on a new crankshaft because the old one was still holding. It went into an account that Carl Becker didn't know existed. Carl Becker's dealership closed in the spring of 1986. The bank took the building, the inventory, the lot. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for a Saturday in April. Danny Jarvis was there. He stood at the back of the crowd, a crowd that was smaller than it should have been, because most of the people who might have bid were in as much trouble as Carl. He watched the auctioneer work through the inventory, tractors going for fractions of what they had been worth 5 years ago. Tools selling for pennies, the slow, humiliating arithmetic of a business being dismantled piece by piece. Then the building came up. The building where a 22-year-old farmer had been told his crankshaft couldn't be fixed. The building where Carl Becker had laughed at the idea of a $15 weld. Opening bid was $60,000, far below what the property was actually worth, but times were desperate and buyers were scarce. Hands went up. Cautious, reluctant hands. 62, 65, 68. Danny raised his hand. 70,000. The other bidders looked at him. They knew who he was. The whole county knew who he was. Junkyard Danny, the man who fixed what couldn't be fixed. They looked at this farmer from a 160-acre spread and tried to do the math, and the math didn't quite add up for them. But they also knew something that made the math irrelevant. They knew that Danny Jarvis had been saving money while they were spending it. They knew his repair business had been thriving through the same years that were destroying everyone else. They knew that the man who had refused to pay $800 for a crankshaft had been quietly, patiently building towards something for 18 years. They knew they were outmatched. The bidding continued. 72, 75. Danny matched every number. At $82,000, the other bidders dropped their hands. Sold, the auctioneer said, to Danny Jarvis, $82,000. Danny walked to the front of the crowd and signed the paperwork, and as the pen was moving across the page, he felt someone at his shoulder, Carl Becker. Danny barely recognized him at first. The man who had walked out to meet him in that parking lot 18 years ago, confident, solid, a man who owned the room without thinking about it, was gone. In his place was a 71-year-old man who had lost everything and who carried that loss in the way he held his shoulders. Danny. Mr. Becker. Carl looked at the building, his building once, then at the man who had just bought it. I suppose you're feeling pretty good right now. Danny thought about it. Actually thought about it for a moment? No, sir. I'm not. He shook his head slowly. I remember what it felt like standing in your parking lot with a broken tractor and $23. I remember what it felt like to think everything was over. I don't wish that feeling on anyone, not even someone who laughed at me. Carl was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, The way voices get when they're carrying more weight than they show. That weld, the one I said wouldn't last a month, Danny smiled. 18 years and counting. 18 years. Carl laughed. A tired, honest laugh. The laugh of a man who has finally made peace with being wrong about something important. I've been wrong about a lot of things, Danny, but I think that might have been the biggest. You weren't wrong about everything, Danny said. You were right that a regular weld wouldn't hold. You were right it was precision work. You just didn't know I had the skills to do it properly. I should have asked. I should have at least given you the chance to prove it. You gave me something better, Mr. Becker. Danny extended his hand. You gave me a reason to prove you wrong. Carl looked at that hand for just a moment, then he shook it. What are you going to do with the building? What do you think? I'm going to fix things, same as I've been doing for 18 years. Just now, I'll have a proper shop to do it in. Carl nodded slowly. There was a long pause. Then, you need any help? I spent 30 years learning about tractors and equipment. Might as well be useful for something. The man who had laughed at him, asking to work for him. Can you start Monday? Jarvis Repair opened in June of 1986, right in the middle of the worst agricultural crisis in 50 years. From the first day, it was full. Farmers came from 3 counties with equipment their dealers had written off, machines they couldn't afford to replace and couldn't afford to leave broken. Danny fixed what could be fixed, charged what working people could actually pay, and taught his customers how to maintain what he had repaired so it wouldn't break the same way twice. Carl Becker worked the phones and the front desk and the paperwork. And he spent a lot of time in the shop watching Danny work, learning in his 70s things he should have understood in his 40s. You know what I figured out working here? Carl said one afternoon, watching Danny run a weld across a cracked engine block. I spent 30 years telling farmers they needed new equipment, convincing them their old machines were failures. That shiny and modern was always better. He shook his head. Most of that old equipment just needed someone who cared enough to understand it. It's not about old or new, Danny said, not looking up from the work. It's about understanding what you have, knowing how it works, treating it like it matters. Like you did with that crankshaft, Danny smiled. Like I did with that crankshaft. I still can't fully believe that weld held. 20 years now. 20 years, Carl agreed and laughed. You know what, Danny? I'm glad you proved me wrong. Somebody needed to. Carl worked at Jarvis Repair for 5 years before he retired for good. He died in 1994 at 79. By every account, those last years at the shop were among the best of his life. Not because of the money, but because he had finally found the honest version of the work he'd been pretending to do for 30 years. The farm all ran until 1998. 30 years on a repair that was supposed to last a month. When it finally stopped, it wasn't the crankshaft. The crankshaft was fine. It was everything else. 30 Oklahoma summers and winters and dust seasons had simply worn the rest of the machine down to its limit. Danny didn't scrap it. He parked it just inside the front door of Jarvis Repair, where every person who walked in could see it. He put a hand-painted sign on it that read, 1952, Farm All H Crankshaft, welded in 1968 for 15 tons. They said it wouldn't last a month. It lasted 30 years. Never stop believing you can fix what others say is broken. That tractor became a landmark. Farmers brought their children to look at it. Old-timers told the story to anyone who hadn't heard it. It showed up in the county historical record and in local newspaper features, and eventually on a plaque installed by the Caddo County Historical Society in 2012. At the ceremony, Danny stood in front of a crowd that included basically everyone in the county who had ever had a piece of equipment repaired, which was basically everyone in the county, and gave a speech he hadn't prepared because he was better with a welding torch than with words. In 1968, I was 22 years old, broke and scared, he said. My father was dead. My brother was gone. I had a farm to run and no working equipment and $23. When the crankshaft cracked, I thought it was over. A man at the dealership told me I had 2 choices. Pay $800 I didn't have or give up. He told me the crankshaft couldn't be fixed. He laughed when I said I'd weld it myself. He paused and looked at the farm, all quiet now, engine cold, standing there like a witness to everything that had happened in the 44 years since. That laugh was the greatest gift he ever gave me, because it made me angry. And that anger made me determined, and that determination made me learn, and that learning kept 30 years of harvests coming off this ground. He looked out at the crowd. Every single one of you has been told something can't be done. Every one of you has been laughed at for trying anyway. So, here's what I want you to take home today. The people who laugh at you don't know what you know. They haven't seen what you've seen. They haven't put in what you've put in. Their limits are not your limits. Their ceilings are not your floors, he pointed at the tractor. That weld lasted 30 years. Not because I was smarter than the dealer, not because I had better equipment, because I refused to believe him when he said it was impossible. I looked at that cracked crankshaft and I saw something fixable. He looked at it and saw scrap. The difference wasn't in the metal. It was in our eyes. Danny Jarvis ran Jarvis Repair until 2008, when he retired at 72. His son Michael took over, trained by his father in the same disciplines Danny had learned from Mr. Patterson 40 years before. When Michael was still an apprentice, he asked his father the question every young tradesman eventually asks. What's the most important thing about fixing equipment? Danny thought about it. He didn't answer fast, because the real answers never come fast. Believing it can be fixed, he said. Most people give up before they even start, because someone told them it was impossible. The first step is refusing to accept that verdict. What's the second step? Danny smiled. Learning the skills to prove them wrong. Danny Jarvis died in 2019 at 83 years old. They buried him on the hill behind the farmhouse where he had grown up, next to his father and his mother, in the ground he had been working since he was old enough to hold a tool. His gravestone reads, Danny Jarvis, 1946-2019. He fixed what couldn't be fixed, the most valuable investment Danny Jarvis ever made.